Man, my hair is getting long. Speaking of long hair. Hey everyone, Davey here, and a new episode for Season 2 of Telltale's The Walking Dead video game has been released, and now I'm here to talk about it. Now, before I get on with that, I think I should go ahead and tell you guys that being that I'm going to be reviewing these episodes one by one, I'm not going to go into full detail about the gameplay or the presentation or even the story for that matter, unless there's some significant changes and big things happening in those departments, if you will, that are large enough to talk about. And I'm just going to go ahead and breeze on through that because I already got most of that down in my review for episode 1 of season 2. So these things are going to go by a little quicker. And because I'm not going to make two separate videos, one that is spoiler free and the other one that's spoiler filled, I'm just going to make one complete video that will go ahead and talk about the game without any spoilers and then get into the spoiler filled territory when it comes to the story. But don't worry, I'm going to go ahead and let you guys know beforehand so you won't have to worry about spoilers. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Episode 2 is entitled A House Divided, and basically it just has Clementine becoming more of a formidable member of this group that we last saw her with at the end of episode 1, and just her trying to find her place within this group. But eventually a certain push comes to shove and they're forced out on the road, and this is where Clementine really proves herself to be a valuable member of this group. And then new characters come to interact with this group and friendships are formed, tension rises, and chaos ensues. Now this is episode 2 of season 2 of Telltale's Walking Dead video games, so the presentation of the gameplay is pretty much the same. There was almost no new additions to either facet of the episode, although there were some notable quips. The traditional Telltale technical glitches are still there, such as the lagging frame rate and very few cutscenes. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but for some reason the character animations weren't that great during the first maybe 20 or 30 minutes of this episode. Maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just saying things, but for some reason there were some rather bad character animations during the beginning of this episode. One good example would be this character scolding Clementine, and he's scolding her in a serious manner, but for some reason he had a smug look on his face, like, I don't know, maybe that's just me, but I just found that to be a little off. And the gameplay, for the most part, is the same. The only problem with the gameplay is that there's hardly any. I found there to be somewhat of a lack of actual gameplay and interactivity, so to speak, in this episode compared to the first one. And part of that may be because the episode is actually rather short. This is shorter than the first episode. It only took me about an hour and 50 minutes to beat. And that does make me a little concerned that Telltale will get just a little lazy, because I remember in season 1, each episode averaged about 3 hours, and so far we're looking at a 2-hour average running time for each episode, and I'm hoping that doesn't really undermine the potential of Telltale and the way that they tell their story through season 2. That doesn't mean that they can't do it. I mean, if don't oversaturate your content with so much, don't make it longer than it has to be. And I understand that that rule also applies to not only movies but also video games. But you can't blame me for being a little cautious. Now, where this episode really shined was, of course, like Telltale always shines, is in the story. I think that the story started off a little slow at the beginning, but it gradually got better, with tension rising and new characters being introduced and a few twists and turns along the way till its climactic end. And I felt like that was a really good way to really structure this episode, because it is by the second episode that you need to start building some form of momentum like season 1 did. And I think they're doing a really good job so far. They haven't done anything to make me worry that Telltale is going in a very bad direction with season 2. And there are a couple of neat surprises in this episode. Surprises that when you see, everything will feel much more connected by this point. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go into full detail, but let's just say that my only complaint would be that one of those surprises though being a sight for sore eyes, was just a little too convenient for the story, and hopefully it gets explained in broader detail in the next couple of episodes at least. But right now, I really would like some more explanation behind this little surprise, because for the moment, I do feel it's just a little too, hey, look, it just happens to be there. But one of the really good things that the plot in episode 2 did very well was really getting us to know, or at least getting me to know, these characters a whole lot more. Because if we're going to be stuck with this group, you need to make us care. And episode 2 does a really good job at that. There were some characters that were being kind of douchey in episode 1, like I stated in my review for that one. But by this episode, there were some characters that flat out come forward and say, yeah, I'm sorry for acting that way. It's been a while since that time in episode 1, so obviously we need to kind of clear the ice a little bit and at least get to know one another. And me, as Clementine, gets to know this character much better, so now I will care more if something were to happen with this character or with this group of characters, and that's what season 1 did extremely well by the finale. And I'm hoping they take season 2 in that same exact direction. Now, there were some things by this episode that could have been handled well should they have happened in another episode. That way, it might have been a little bit more effective. But I still think that they did a really good job, and so far I have no worries to what Telltale has in store for us for the next episode. So because of that, I'm going to go ahead and give episode 2 of season 2 of The Walking Dead, A House Divided, an 8 out of 10. I think it's a very solid episode, but I think it really would have pushed it to the edge should some of these things could have waited for the next episode. And now granted, that could have taken away from how I viewed this episode or scored it, but then that would have made the next episode just all the more heartfelt and emotional and overall amazing. So now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about spoilers. So obviously, if you have not played episode 2 of The Walking Dead, it's out now. By the time this video goes up, the episode should be available for everybody to play, whether it be PlayStation 3 or Xbox or whatever. It should be out, go play it, and then come back and watch the remainder of this video. So one thing that I want to get out of the way is that we've gotten to know these characters just a little bit more, these supporting characters that we're stuck with as Clementine, but I actually kind of want to know a little bit more about Clementine herself. I mean, sure, season 1 kind of did that a little bit, but I want to know some of the things that are going on in her head, which we did get a little bit in this episode. That line where she says that she had a tree house, and it brought us back to that very first moment where she meets Lee at the beginning of season 1, with her being stuck up in that tree house, and then she says she hated it. I just felt like that was a very, very good way to kind of take a small little peek into how her character works. She hated a treehouse, but she had to go in there because she needed to protect herself. I want more moments like that as the season develops, because I feel like we haven't gotten our fair share of that so far. But let's go ahead and tackle the big elephant in the room, the return of Kenny. Kenny finally comes back into the mix in just the second episode of season 2, so chances are he's going to be a big player for the remainder of the season. Now, this is the thing. He was the surprise appearance that I had that minor complaint about being just a little bit too convenient, because for now, we don't know how he managed to end up in that lodge. We know that he made that Indian girl, I think her name was Sarita, might be wrong about that, but I like that we're seeing a little bit of character development with Kenny in the form of him finding a new girlfriend and trying to move on, but still holding on to that past by calling Clementine Duck. I'm liking what they're doing with Kenny. There's some shades of the new Kenny that is just gone to shit. You know, he's just broken with the old Kenny, where he starts to get a little aggressive with Luke and Nick at the dinner table. So I'm liking Kenny so far, not because he's a likable character, but because he's just fascinating to watch. But I'm hoping they explain how this comes full circle and how he conveniently manages to meet with Clementine, because right now I'm having a slight difficulty buying it. The second surprise would be Bonnie from 400 Days. She makes an appearance in this episode, and she was very welcome, and I love that they're not wasting any time in having some characters from 400 Days connecting with season 2. Now, I really don't want to play 400 Days again, but I'm having the most difficult time trying to remember what happened with Bonnie at the end of my playthrough for 400 Days, so I'm having a tough time also trying to figure out how she conveniently catches up with Clementine in the ski lodge, but it makes more sense with her because Bonnie never interacted with anybody from season 1 because 400 Days was a standalone. So it makes much more sense for her to come into contact with Clementine. Whereas Kenny is just a little too convenient because we know that they've been through a lot together in season 1, so that one's a little bit more difficult to understand, whereas Bonnie just makes a lot more sense. One thing that I feel like Telltale is taking a page, pun intended, from not only the comics but also the TV show would be to build a formidable antagonist, which develops both optimism and concerns in me, and that comes in the form of our main villain, Carver, who gets foreshadowed in episode 1 but finally gets introduced here in episode 2. And so far he is a rather evil guy, and he's that kind of evil guy that feels justified, which makes for some of the best villains. Though the bad guys that are not necessarily just being the mustache twirling villain, but they feel like they're right. They feel like they're the good guys. So I find those kinds of villains fascinating, and that could go in a really great direction. But I'm also fearing that season 2 will start to transform a little bit like season 3 of the TV show managed to become, especially with that whole thing with Andrea that the majority of people, including me, hated. I really don't want Telltale to go in that direction, and they could, but I so far feel a little bit optimistic and confident in Telltale to not go in that direction and make Carver a really good villain that I believe they built from scratch. I don't think he's from the comics, so if they manage to make a character that could be part of the Walking Dead universe and make him memorable at the same time, I'm all for that. And we're kind of seeing hints of that because based on the whole next time on the Walking Dead segment, you can kind of tell that we're going to be brought back to Carver's camp, which could be some form of parallel with the governor's Woodbury. And so you can kind of see how I can be a little bit worried and at the same time really interested in what direction Telltale might take this. And I did think that the episode ended on a really good note, having Clementine and the group being taken hostage by Carver back to the camp and not dragging it out too long, even though I did say that they're starting to get a little bit short with their episodes, and I'm hoping that that's not Telltale getting lazy. But like I said, I do feel like it ended at the right point, so that goes back to what I said earlier in this video, where don't stretch out your things, whether it be movies or video games, too long, or else you'll lose your audience. And I think they did a smart decision in ending it at that point. Now, I do feel like it would have been more effective to have Walter being taken hostage and then maybe killed at the camp in episode 3. That way we've spent enough time with him to the point that where he does get killed, it would hurt. It would hurt us as a player. When he got killed by the end of this episode, I did gasp because he was a likable character, especially the exchange he had with Clementine about John Steinbeck and about politics. I really dug his character. So it was a shame to see him go so early, but I felt it would have been a lot more emotional and gut-wrenching should that have happened in the next episode rather than in this one where we just barely got to know him. Especially knowing that Nick offed his boyfriend. I mean, but by the way, if you couldn't already tell that those two were gay, I don't know what, because they were gay. They were not friends like Luke aforementioned. They were gay. They were gay. Who gives a knife with their initials engraved into it? I mean, they were gay. So it makes it a little bit more, a bit of a more, oh man, that sucks kind of moment when it turns out that Nick killed his partner on the bridge. So I felt like that would have been a lot more effective if we have gotten to know a little bit more about Walter, and maybe Walter would share how he depended on Matthew to look at the bright side of things and to be much more optimistic, like we got to see him as when he was making the food and talking to Clementine about the politics. That would have been a lot more effective should his death been prolonged to at least that third episode. And I'm all for keeping us in suspense, Telltale, but I really hope that it doesn't become a trend to have a particular character of the group disappear by the end of this episode and then you can just call that your cliffhanger. Don't do that. You did that at the end of episode 1 and now you did it again in episode 2 with the disappearance of Luke. okay, they were good, but don't rely too much on that. So that's really about it for all the spoilery stuff that I can talk about for episode 2. If you have played it, let me know what you guys thought, and I'll see you guys whenever they decide to release episode 3 to talk about said episode. But until then, take care. I'll see you guys later.